everybody, Rob Jensen here. I'd like to say hi to everybody from PBC. Sorry we can't get together under the circumstances, but we thought this was maybe a good way to still try and stay in touch by having our daily teaching times, and so I'd like to share some with you today. I guess I'd first ask a question or two. Have you ever not paid attention to someone and then regretted it later? Or have you said something before and you thought about it and maybe, it didn't really go over very well? Or the ever popular fly off the handle at someone only to find out later on that you were the one that was wrong? How'd that go for you? Well, welcome to James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. So if you want to turn there, we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the book of James. And in James chapter 1, verse 19, it says, "My dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness." Well, James has quite the passage here that's a little bit of a toe stepper, I'm sure, for all of us. But I really like how he starts out, because he starts out really kind of teaching this section by example. Notice that as he starts by saying, "My dear brothers and sisters, understand this," he's not being, real fast to speak, and he's not browbeating them or things like that. He's actually showing a little bit of this as an example. So he does this by first affectionately calling them his dear brothers and sisters. And then also, though, giving a little bit of a commandment here as far as the emphasis of why this is so important when he says, "Understand this." So it's not even something that he looks at as, "Oh, well, I'm going to tell you about these things, but I hope it's, you can maybe use it for some advice." No, he wants you to understand it. And I think part of it is because probably if James is like the rest of us, somewhere in his life, he didn't do these three things, or he saw others not do these three things, and he saw the adverse effects and consequences that came from it. So I think that's why he's probably pretty adamant that we actually listen to this passage. And he takes really just three very simple, everyday, practical principles that we can all live by and really see the effects of walking closer to God if we do. So let's take a look at these. The first one he says in verse 19, of course, is we should be quick to listen. The old saying, I'm sure you've heard, is that we have two ears and one mouth. So we should listen twice as much as we speak or as we talk. And I think there is quite a bit of good, practical, sound advice to that. And as we see in many times throughout Scripture, that Jesus was very quick to listen. He always would listen to others. And it didn't matter if they were adversaries or if they were people who were lost souls that he cared about and loved deeply. He listened. He wanted to hear what they had to say. And I think that speaks volumes for what we should be doing as well. But as we talk about being quick to listen, there's really some common sense approaches as to why we should. If you think about it, if you ever try to put something together, following or reading the directions or listening to the directions would actually help you to be able to see your end goal come out more successfully. I know in many Christmases, trying to put toys together, that was what I ended up having to do the most, was follow directions. Or sometimes listening is very good when we're looking for advice and being able to listen to what people have to say and then decipher whether it would be good for us to heed that advice or not. And it's always good to listen as far as our study of the Word. And when we listen to whether Pastor Curtis or Pastor Justin or whoever's speaking, and listening in order to gain more insight into who God is and develop a deeper relationship with Him. So listening can be very, very beneficial for us. And James, I think, does a nice job of really hoping that we realize that and can point that out. Also, thing about being quick to listen, it also shows fruits of the Spirit. As we see in Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit. And some of the fruits of the Spirit that you'll see if you are quick to listen would be, we are quick to listen out of love for others as they're speaking to us about problems they may have, or even if they have an issue with us and they're bringing it to our attention. And being able to be quick to listen, not quick to speak, but quick to listen, It shows love. It shows patience, being patient as we listen to those who share their burdens with us. It shows kindness, gentleness, and also self-control, because sometimes we don't want to listen and our flesh tells us, speak out. And that's a time when the fruit of the Spirit should take over and help us to be more of the self-control mindset. But it also, being quick to listen, provides us with many opportunities to really be effective ministers to someone, either physically or mentally, and above all, spiritually. That if we can be quick to listen to them and hear what they're going through or the problems that they have, it allows us then to know how to serve them better and to be that light in a dark world for some people that might need it at the time. So being quick to listen is a very good, productive principle to follow, as James points out. But then, of course, we go on here, and we see in the latter part of verse 19, it says, quick to listen, and then, number 2, slow to speak. Mom always said, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we don't put the filter in place, and I know many times my personal experiences have taught me to engage my brain before my mouth. And many times growing up, I didn't do that and suffered the consequences for that, rightfully so. So it's a process of learning to be slow to speak, to take careful thought before we utter anything from our mouth. And we'll learn more about why that's important in a second, especially when we talk about the tongue. But we should always try to formulate an appropriate Christ-like response. It's one thing to have an appropriate response, but it's another thing to have an appropriate Christ-like response. And again, remembering that we're that shining light to a lot of people who are looking for us to be that reflection of who Jesus is. And being slow to speak can help us remember that and help us to be able to speak to them better and more Christ-like. Again, we see in this one, fruits of the Spirit. What are some of the fruits of the Spirit? We exhibit patience by being slow to speak. We definitely exhibit kindness and gentleness and self-control. There it is again. But we also learn that the tongue is very, very harmful. In fact, James even goes on a little later in the book. If we skip over to James chapter 3 and we look at a few verses, in chapter 3 and verse 7 through 10, he says, every kind of animal, bird, reptile, fish is tamed and has been tamed by humankind, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, these things should not be this way. It's pretty strong stuff about the tongue, which is another very valuable reason why we should always be very slow to speak. Not slow speaking, but slow to speak. We don't want to retaliate quickly without thinking it through and asking, how can I exhibit Christ through my response? It also will afford us opportunities, if we're slow to speak, to edify others and encourage them and instruct them in some cases, and doing so as Christ would do for us. So slow to speak is another thing to be mindful of. And the third one, of course, is slow to anger. This is a tough one. This is where we battle our flesh day in and day out to want to respond in ways that are not Christ-like. Hot tempers are never very productive. Proverbs speaks of the qualities of being slow to anger. And then also tells us not just some of the qualities, but also some of the things that can happen if we're not. Let's look at a few. Proverbs 14:29, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. So as we look at some of these others, there's many others here too. We've got 15:18, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. Or we look at 16:32, which says, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. So keeping control of that anger, keeping control of that tongue is very important. And 29:22 in Proverbs says, a man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression. So we see not only in the book of James in chapter 3, where he talks about how evil the tongue can be, which happens a lot when we're angry. We also see Proverbs direct how anger is really not a good thing, especially when you consider that a lot of our anger as human beings comes out of revenge, bitterness, pride, pettiness. All of these things are contrary to who God is. And all of these things will become stumbling blocks to us as we try to show who Christ is to people that don't know him, which is why it's so very important to be slow to anger. And verse 20 tells us why we shouldn't do that. James goes on and says in the last verse there of the two we're looking at, he says, for human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. You see, really, there's only one person who could ever really be justified to ever be angry, and that's really God, and that's it. Because being the creator of all and having to put up with all of the wickedness and rebellion and sinfulness and evil that we as humans have done to him and to others throughout, ever since Adam and Eve, he would have a right to be angry at that. But we in our flesh, we need to be slow to anger because Christ died for that. Christ died for those sins. And so we need to try and show who Christ is to those around us that need him. And I think that's really what James is talking about here, because really the subsection here of 19 and 20 is under the heading of hearing and doing the word. And if we're hearing and doing the word, it means we need to be slow to speak, slow to anger, and also quick to listen. Well, James addresses three simple things that we can do from a common sense standpoint, but can be very beneficial to those that we come in contact with. Well, I hope that maybe you can use this as a challenge this week to maybe try and help yourself to be quick to listen when you have the opportunity, to be slow to speak, and to be able to formulate and think about what you want to say, and also to be slow to anger. I hope that this passage blesses you as much as it has me and convicts you as much as it has me. So hopefully we'll get together next week and continue on with some more teachings. Thanks for listening, everybody. Stay safe out there, and Lord willing, we'll see you next week.